Welcome to the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada's webcast called Clinical Trials, What You Need to Know. In this presentation, Don Richards will provide blood cancer patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals nationally with an overview of clinical trials concepts and processes. The objective is to give listeners a better understanding of the information about clinical trials and to deliver reliable and trustworthy resources. Furthermore, we will also hear the first-hand experiences of clinical trial participant Katie Coniglio. My name is Sonia Muto, the Community Program Coordinator for the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society of Canada. I will be the host of this online event. During the webcast, you will hear only my voice and the speakers' voices. Since there are many of you, questions may be asked at the end, but only online using the question or chat function. The presentation will last approximately 1 hour and will be followed by a 15 to 20-minute question period. The presentation is being recorded. Therefore, you will be able to listen to it again on our website while following along with the PowerPoint presentation. We will send you an email when everything is available online. Our mission is to cure blood cancers and improve the quality of life for patients and their families. We offer support to people affected by blood cancer every step of the way. Please reach out to us if need be. We have several informative tools, such as fact sheets and booklets, available on our website, llscanada.org. We also have a series of educational videos accessible on our website. I would now like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Dawn Richards. She is the founder of 502 Labs, Inc. and the Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. With a PhD in analytical chemistry from the University of Alberta and experience in a variety of roles during the past 15 years, it is her diagnosis with rheumatoid arthritis 10 years ago that instigated a journey to combine her passion for science with making the most of her diagnosis. Over to you, Dawn.
Hey, thank you, Sonia. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society for having me here today and for all of you for participating. A little bit about Clinical Trials Ontario. Our vision and mission statements are here, and overall our goal really is to help make the environment in Ontario a good one for conducting clinical trials. So we really want to improve the environment in Ontario so that people can do clinical trials and so that individuals like you can participate in clinical trials. So Clinical Trials Ontario, or CTO, really has 3 strategic pillars. One is to streamline processes to support timely, efficient, and cost-effective conduct of high-quality clinical trials. The second one really is to engage, so to support and promote public and patient engagement with clinical trials. That's what we're going to be talking about today. And lastly, it's to promote. So Ontario has a number of advantages in terms of clinical trial capabilities and capacities, and we really want to do a good job in promoting those. So you can find us on our website at www.ctontario.ca. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the patient and public portion of our website. And I wanted to let people know that everything we've done in the patients and public section of our website, we have done in collaboration with patients in the public, health charities, and patient organizations. Again, when you select Learn More about Clinical Trials, this is what the screen will look like on our website, and we're going to walk through some of these today. This is kind of laid out in terms of a journey, in terms of where you are in terms of wanting to learn more about clinical trials, or maybe you're looking specifically for a clinical trial. So really you'd select which section you're interested in here, And underneath each of these sections, you'd find some frequently asked questions and some answers to help you inform yourself about clinical trials. So I'm going to go into some of the questions that I know people are interested in here. First of all, what are clinical trials? So we often think about clinical trials involving drugs. They don't always involve drugs. They're more than just that. They are a type of research, so it's important to know that they're part of the research process, and they involve people. They test what's called interventions. So these are health-related interventions or treatments. And they often answer questions about interventions such as, is it safe? Does it improve or cure disease or help people live longer with disease than other types of treatments? And does it help people feel better? So those are some of the questions that clinical trials are designed to answer. As I mentioned previously, we often will think of clinical trials being about drugs, but they really are about different types of other treatments and interventions. So some of those might include drugs. They might include medical devices. They might include surgery, radiation therapy, diagnostic procedures, and maybe even diet and lifestyle interventions. So they're more than just about drugs, although we often will associate them with drugs. And why are clinical trials done in the first place? So they're done to provide data or evidence about the treatment or intervention that's tested. And they help us decide what therapies or interventions might work best for people. And the evidence that we get from clinical trials can really help us out in different ways. It might help to inform decisions and tell us about the safety of an intervention. And these results might be used by companies to help them as they develop new therapies and devices. They might be used by doctors or other healthcare providers in their daily practice. They might be used by regulatory agencies like Health Canada to know what's safe and effective. And even governments use these results to help make decisions about healthcare and the allocation of dollars for healthcare. So sometimes we're asked how you know if a clinical trial is reputable or credible. And so some of the things that you might ask yourself, or when you look at the study, take a look at, are the costs of the clinical trials covered? So you shouldn't ever be asked to provide a fee to participate in a clinical trial. The study treatments should be covered. You might have to pay some out-of-pocket expenses like transportation or parking, maybe childcare, but you shouldn't be asked for a fee to participate. You might take a look at the qualifications of the clinical trial team. So are these individuals maybe that have done a lot of work in this particular area before? Maybe they're associated with an academic organization or hospital. And then you might take a look and see how the clinical trial has been reviewed or approved. So in Canada, clinical trial applications are reviewed by Health Canada, which is our regulatory agency. They need to be reviewed by a research ethics board or an REB, and they'll take a look at the study being acceptable from their perspective. And also the clinical trial needs to be reviewed and approved by the institution or the organization where it's taking place. So those are some of the questions you might look at or you might ask about if you're considering participation in a study. Next is the design of clinical trials. So you might have heard of the phases of clinical trials, and really the design is based on the question you're trying to answer and the information that's already known about the intervention of the treatment. So phase 1, this is also typically first in human. So this is the first time the intervention's been tested in people. These are smaller studies and they're designed to look at safety, excuse me, dose and side effects. And this is usually in people that don't have the condition that's under study. Phase 2 studies, these are looking at a larger number of people. And this is looking at dose and does the intervention do what it's supposed to do? And also, again, looking at side effects. And this is usually in the condition that you're interested in the intervention being part of. Phase 3 is looking at thousands of people, and these are often done globally. And here, the researchers are looking at how long the effects last, as well as continuing to study side effects. And phase 4 studies happen after the intervention is approved for market. And so here we're looking at tens of thousands of people, and these are longer term studies. And again, we're looking at longer term side effects. You may have heard of randomized clinical trials, and these are typically phase 3 studies when 2 or more interventions or treatment arms are compared to each other. And this is when participants are assigned by chance to one of the interventions. And the idea is that assigning by chance reduces the chance of bias when results are looked at. If you're considering a clinical trial, of course, you've got other options to consider too, and we've listed those here. So one of those might be receiving no treatment. Another one might be receiving standard treatment or a different form of treatment than what you're currently on if you live with a disease or a condition. And the third option might be participating in a different research study altogether. And I'd really advise you to talk to your doctor about potential benefits and risks of any of these options, including no treatment. I think having an informed discussion with your physician or other healthcare provider could really be helpful for you if these are some of the options that you're thinking about. There are different ways you might choose to find a clinical trial. Again, it might be part of your conversation with your healthcare provider. It might be coming to an organization like LLS and asking them if they know anything about clinical trials. You might contact a hospital or an organization that does research. In that case, you might need to be prepared for potential follow-ups and maybe chasing people down. You might follow up with an ad you've seen in the newspaper, the TV, or the radio. And I'm going to talk briefly about a clinical trial finder that Clinical Trials Ontario has also developed with input from patients and health charities and patient organizations to help you out. So this is what Clinical Trials Ontario's Clinical Trials Finder looks like. You'll see within the screen that there's a bit of a landing page that describes what it is and how it works. If you look at the left-hand side of the screen, there's really limited information that you would put into the system to help you find a clinical trial or to help you look for a clinical trial. So you can put in your condition. You can put in your location if you want to. You can search by proximity to your postal code, or you can search by province in Canada, or you can search all of Canada. You can look at study phase if you're interested in that, and there's some demographics that you can put in there also. So those are really, some of them are really optional things that you can search. And then what would happen is once you do a search, you'll be provided with a number of different clinical trials, and you can click on each one of those and information is presented in a fairly logistical way for you. And if there is contact information for the clinical trial, then it's provided and you can certainly follow up and contact those individuals. Again, this clinical trial finder sits on top of a database called clinicaltrials.gov, which is a global database that's centered out of the National Institutes for Health in the US. Kind of like a gold standard database for looking for clinical trials, but we've just made searching it a lot easier, and we've allowed for the results that come back to look a lot simpler and less confusing or overwhelming than they potentially look like in the original database. I did want you to know too that using the finder, I pulled up some results for different types of blood cancers. And those are listed here that are currently recruiting in Canada. So you can see that there are a number of different options for different types of blood cancers here that you may be interested in. And I can take some questions at the end of the webinar, or you can contact myself or my colleagues here at LLS to help you out with this if you're interested in it. So we often get asked, how do I decide if a clinical trial is a good one for me? This is really going to be up to you to decide on yourself. But some of the things that you might ask are really similar to our clinical trials credible or reputable. The only one that's different from looking at that is the last one at the very bottom. That is, do you meet the eligibility criteria to be in the clinical trial? So there will be specific criteria for people to be eligible for or not eligible for a clinical trial. We're going to go over that a little bit later, but you will have to so-called qualify for a clinical trial. So even though you're interested in it, you do have to meet certain criteria to be part of the Some of you may have heard of what's called a clinical trial protocol, and you can kind of think of the protocol as being almost like a blueprint for the clinical trial. So this is something that's put together to plan for the entire clinical trial. There's a lot of information within the protocol, and it's a detailed document that's got information on the purpose of the clinical trial, so why it's actually being done, who's involved in the clinical trial, so whether it's the study team, the sponsor, the participants, how the results will be gathered, analyzed, and shared, and overall how the clinical trial will be done. A little bit more information about the typical protocol parts. There's a scientific and medical justification that has to be provided. There's something called key measurements or endpoints. So that's really what the clinical trial is aiming to do at the end of the day. We just talked briefly about the eligibility of the clinical trial. So that means who can be in the clinical trial and what those criteria are, and who cannot be in the clinical trial and what their criteria are. There will be information about the assessment, so that might be doctor's visits, that might be blood tests, that might be questionnaires that participants are asked to fill in. There will be a sample consent form. There will be information on the number of participants that are required for the clinical trial and why that number is required, how the results will be analyzed and shared. There will be information on reporting of the safety of the intervention and what that looks like, what the treatment or treatments are that will be used and potential adjustments to treatment over time, and then what data will be collected. So what information will be collected throughout the life of the clinical trial. So those are typical parts of the protocol that will be developed obviously before the clinical trial starts and will be agreed on and reviewed by a number of the organizations that I'd indicated at the beginning of the presentation. Informed consent is an important part of being a participant in a clinical trial. Really important to let you know that consent is voluntary. So it's completely up to you if you'd like to participate in a clinical trial, if you meet the eligibility criteria. It's important to know that you can withdraw at any time during the clinical trial. So even if you've started off thinking you want to be in the clinical trial and later on you decide, for whatever reason that you don't want to be in the clinical trial, that is totally okay. And it's also important to know that consent is an ongoing process. So consent isn't just a one-time you fill out the consent form and agree to participate in the study. It's an ongoing process where you can ask questions, you should be comfortable with being involved in the study, and if that's not the case, you can withdraw. You can also, if you decide to withdraw, request that your data and any biological samples that you've submitted also be withdrawn from the clinical trial. So a little bit more about withdrawal, just to reiterate, if you've started a clinical trial and you've decided that it's not for you for whatever reason, you don't have to provide a reason to the clinical trial team to withdraw. You might be asked to provide a reason, but you shouldn't feel pressured that you have to provide one. You are encouraged to talk to the study doctor or the staff about your decision, and they may help you make your decision or answer any questions about it before you decide to make that decision. You should know that you may be asked questions about your experience, and in order to have you safely stop the study, you might be asked to do some final lab tests or physical exams, and that's really for your own benefit. And then again, to reiterate, you may be able to withdraw your permission to use information that was collected about you and any biological samples that you submitted as well. If you can't find a clinical trial, there might be some other routes that you choose to go. Some of them, I'm going to be honest with you, may be more labor intensive than others. So maybe there's a clinical trial that's in another city or another location that you're interested in. You could contact the study team. You might ask them things about, is it even possible to participate when you're in a different location? And if it is, how will this affect you? So, you know, what kind of costs, for example, might you have to incur, or would they be able to help offset? So those are some things you might consider. There may be ways to bring the clinical trial closer to you. Again, those may be fairly labor intensive to kind of advocate for a site to be set up closer to you. Another option might be that you simply keep up to date on the research and you check time to time to see if there is a clinical trial that's closer to you that you can participate in. I've known people who have watched studies in other countries happen, and then within a few months, locations have opened up in Canada or closer to home that they've then been able to inquire about and participate about. So that those may be options for you. I already went over this, but just to reiterate, if the clinical trial is not close to you, you might ask the study team if it is possible for you to still participate. And again, remember that it may affect you in different ways if you're not close to a location. So there might be transportation and accommodation costs, or maybe the sponsor or the team can help you figure out how to offset these if that's even an option. Lastly, again, just to reiterate, this is our website at Clinical Trials Ontario. So it's ctontario.ca. And the slides that I've been talking about today are found under our Patients and Public portal, which is pretty obvious, the very right-hand side of the screen there that you can see the drop-down for. So I'm going to pass it back to Sarah, and thanks a lot for allowing me to participate today.
Dawn, for sharing information on clinical trials and the process. My name is Sarah Kahn. I'm the Community Engagement Manager for Ontario with the LSC. It's my pleasure to introduce Katie Coniglio to hear her experiences as a Hodgkin's lymphoma patient who's undergone a clinical trial at Princess Margaret Hospital. She's also one of our First Connection peer volunteers. So welcome, Katie. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. It would be great to get started. If you could give the audience some background, could you please share a little bit about your blood cancer diagnosis?
Yes. So I was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in March of 2015. At the time, I was 25 years old. I had actually just got married the past July, and I was down at Credit Valley in Mississauga when I was suggested for a clinical trial down at Princess Margaret. So after doing my research, I went through with the clinical trial for Hodgkin's lymphoma. I was given a drug called brentuximab, and from there I underwent 6 months of chemotherapy, 12 cycles. So I was down at Princess Margaret for chemo every 2 weeks from there.
So what was the kind of initial reason why you considered the trial? I mean, it wouldn't have been the first option maybe provided to you.
Nope, it definitely wasn't the first option provided to me. However, it was brought up to me pretty quickly. I think I considered all my options. However, I don't think I didn't consider a trial. With Hodgkin's lymphoma, they had such a great success rate already with the drugs they were using. So for me, receiving the brentuximab that was supposed to be less harsh on my body, I figured that, or I hoped, I was optimistic that it would be, if not the same, but better than the drugs that they were already using in chemo for Hodgkin's.
And so could you describe what sort of the process was or the testing requirements, kind of what you underwent being a participant of this trial?
Yes, absolutely. Being a participant in the trial, I was definitely down at the hospital more often than people that were undergoing the regular treatment for Hodgkin's lymphoma. I'd go down for chemo either on a Wednesday or Thursday, and depending on the cycle I was on, I would have chemo on a Wednesday, and then I'd be back at the hospital on Thursday and Friday to do blood work for the trial. And then on other days, I would have chemo, say on the Thursday, and I would be there on the Wednesday, the day before, doing blood work as well. So I was definitely there more often for blood work, and that was the same for my scans. I had CT scans more often, PET scans more often than someone undergoing the regular treatment.
So would you say there was a set schedule, or is this just based on?
Nope, there was a set schedule. For example, on cycles 1 and 5, so my first chemo and my 5th chemo, I went down to Princess Margaret on a Wednesday and I received my chemo, and then I was back there the 2 days to follow to do blood work for the trial. So I was given a schedule and like an appointment schedule for almost everything, and it was all written out there for me, that I knew when I had to be down there, when I was getting scans, and how often when I needed to do blood work.
Great. So obviously there's a lot of travel and whatnot. Were there any out-of-pocket expenses that you incurred as being part of this trial?
I definitely incurred some out-of-pocket expenses because I was there so often. I was still going down after treatment, right? The clinical trial doesn't stop when you're done your treatment. So I was incurring some out-of-pocket expenses. However, they did give me a daily allowance of when I was going down there for any food or travel, and I believe it was up $20 to $25 a day. However, it was up to me to submit those costs. So I did submit some of the costs. However, I didn't submit them all. So I definitely did incur some out-of-pocket expenses. Yes.
Yeah, I guess you have to be proactive with that. And I guess, is there any help with managing that process or any input on their end? Like, do they help facilitate any of that, or is it completely on you?
It was completely on me. I had to, you had to fill out a form, you had to submit your receipts, and you had to submit it to the hospital. So so at the time going through treatment, that wasn't always on my mind. So of course I definitely didn't submit all the money that I would have spent going down there and travel and food.
So could you sort of outline what the risks and benefits were for participating, and obviously what you were considering before you even went into the trial? So what could have been a potential risk?
Yeah, I think the biggest risk before going into the trial would have been that Hodgkin's lymphoma patients, the regular treatment, the ABVD treatment, drugs that they were already giving patients, it had a very good success rate. So I think my risk was that the drug that I was being trialed for wasn't going to be as successful as what they had already like kind of mastered. So that would have been one of the biggest risks for me. However, like other risks, like there were side effects that of course went along with the brentuximab drug. And I did have side effects through chemo, but I can't speak to the fact that those weren't associated with the other drugs I was receiving. So I did have hair loss, mouth sores, jaw pain, constipation, tiredness through it all. Whether that was associated with that specific drug, I don't know, but I did get some of those side effects for sure.
Right. And then certainly obviously there are great benefits to participating. Could you share what those were for you specifically?
For me specifically with that, I mean, I did have those side effects, but I felt very fortunate going through chemotherapy because I felt like my side effects weren't as harsh as they maybe could have been. And that was what that trial drug was supposed to do, was supposed to attack the Hodgkin's lymphoma, the disease, the cells itself. So I hope that is exactly what it did for me. And also the benefits was I got a lot of attention from the hospital, from the nurses, because I was doing blood work and scans more often. And for me personally, that was it gave me a lot of reassurance and a peace of mind that I was being followed so closely through such a difficult journey in your life. So for me, that was a huge benefit. And as well as I was hoping in the end that at least I could help other people if this drug is deemed successful in the end. So that was a big benefit, of course.
Yeah, of course. That's great. What's your current involvement with the trial today? Like I know you're still sort of in active maintenance. You are considered in remission though.
Yes, I am considered in remission. And right when I finished chemo, I continued with the trial. I was seen every 3 months for a while, finishing treatment, and then it moved to every 6 months. So what that looked like, I was going back and doing scans, CT scans, blood work, and then it moved to every 6 months. And it's still every 6 months I'll go down for blood work or scans. However, I've recently had a baby and I'm breastfeeding, so that I no longer do scans. I'm just doing blood work.
Thank you, Katie. Thanks for sharing your experience with us and providing some insight on the process.
No problem.
Thank you. I'm just going to switch here. So I'm now going to turn to some of our resources at the Leukemia Lymphoma Society that support clinical trials. So we have the Information Resource Center. You can connect with them at the 1-800 number above. And when you call in, you're connected to a master level oncology specialist that's available to you to answer questions specifically about blood cancers and treatment options. There's also a language line for translation support and a registered dietitian for free nutritional counseling. So within this IRC, we have the Clinical Trial Support Center. And this is a free service available to patients, caregivers, and healthcare professionals, in which a nurse educator helps a patient understand what clinical trials are, which clinical trials are currently open. They also provide you the support of conducting that search and giving you a list of clinical trials to potentially connect with. There's also additional support in helping you enroll in the suitable trial. All of this, of course, has to be done in consent with your healthcare professional, so it's never done outside of that. This is a great resource available to you as a patient or to the healthcare professional as well.
Thank you so much, Dawn, Katie, and Sarah, for sharing this really valuable information with us. It's very much appreciated. We will now start taking some general questions. Please remember, since there are many of you, please use the question or chat functions to pose any important questions that you feel would benefit not only the listeners, but yourself. And I'll take a look to see what we've received so far. Okay, so the first one is, how do you know the trial you will undergo is safer than current medical treatment?
Dawn, yes.
So that's a good. I think
It's important to know that there's always potential benefits and risks associated with being in a clinical trial. And I think, as Katie indicated, those are really personal, so the decision is really up to you. It's important to know that clinical trials are designed as much as possible to minimize risks as much as possible. So, they're designed as much as possible to try and, like I said, minimize those risks. Generally, things are watched very closely to see, what kind of so-called adverse events are happening. So what kind of safety events are happening, and that continues to be closely monitored throughout the study. So first of all, things are not going to be brought to the clinical trial stage if they don't have a level of safetiness or of safety that people feel could be tolerable in people. And the first phase of clinical trials really is about looking at the safety profile as well. So if the so-called first in human studies do not look appropriate, clinical trials can be stopped early for both good and bad reasons. So things are monitored very closely from a safety perspective, and those decisions will be made appropriately.
Okay, thank you. I have another question here. Is it common for patients to drop out of clinical trials? And those that do, have they provided reasons for it?
So that's another good question. I think overall, it will depend on the study and the individual in terms of how long they decide to continue. Given the number of clinical trials that have happened, it's safe to say that more people stay in them than drop out. Sometimes there are more issues on the front end with recruiting individuals to participate versus once they get going and having people drop out of studies. To the point of if they are asked for reasons, again, that's going to depend on the individual clinical trial and what the kind of protocol is when people do decide to withdraw. So that may or may not happen as people withdraw from the study. It's really up to how the protocol was designed in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another good question here, are the clinical trial results shared with the participants after the trial is completed? And how does the patient know if they were in the control group or experimental group in a randomized clinical trial?
Another good question. So it really is best practice for results to be shared back to participants after they have completed a clinical trial. That may or may not happen, I'll be honest with you. And sometimes results do not become publicly available and even available to participants until quite some time after the clinical trial is completed. So, and that may be for a number of reasons. We do at Clinical Trials Ontario promote that results be shared back to participants. Participants are sharing so much of themselves, so that really is a courtesy that we do encourage. And I am sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yes, of course. So the second part of the question is, how does the patient know if they were in the control group or the experimental group in the randomized clinical trial?
So it may or may not be possible for people to learn about which group they were in after they've finished participating. There have been cases where participants have felt that they've known which arm of the study they have been in just by the results that they have experienced in the trial. So again, it may or may not be possible to learn after the study which arm of the randomized trial you've been in.
Okay. Another question here is, are you familiar with any clinical trials for mantle cell lymphoma in Ontario for patients who have a reoccurrence after first remission?
So offhand, I'm not. I think that that would be a good question to either email to the LLS group or even myself to help with the search for.
Yeah, exactly. We can go through our support center and try to help locate a trial if applicable.
Excellent, thank you. I have one here that's directed to Katie. So when did Katie know that she was receiving brentuximab? I'm sorry, I think Katie is on mute. Let me unmute.
Sorry, I'm just going to check.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There you go.
Hi there. Yes, I actually knew that I was receiving brentuximab, that I was in that arm before I started my treatment. And I don't know if that was because I was in the last phase of the trial, but I did know beforehand.
All right, I have another question here. So what happens once the clinical trial is done and with the patient and they are they followed further with any other doctors?
Maybe you'd like to start off with your experience there and then I can chime in as well.
Sorry, it canceled out part of that question. If you could just repeat it, I would be happy to answer it.
Yeah, so basically the question is asking what happens once a clinical trial is completed to all the patients. Do they continue to be followed, or is there something that they need to go back to their own doctors?
I think actually I was told recently that my clinical trial was coming to an end. So once that happens, then I continue just with my oncologist and the nurse that's attached to that oncologist. I know that's what will happen for me. I'm not sure if it's the same at every hospital.
Yep, and this is Dawn here. I can tell you that usually after the clinical trial, you'll continue to be seen by your regular medical team, but that medical care may change based on your participation in the clinical trial, and that kind of also depends on benefits or side effects that from the intervention that you experience. And then you may also continue to be followed by the study team. There may be some additional tests or examinations related to follow-up, but that will be laid out for you before you start your participation in the study.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for Katie, actually. Katie, were you able to work while undergoing a trial, or was it too treatment intensive?
You know what? It was too treatment intensive. I didn't work through chemo. But with that being said, I don't know if that had anything to do with the trial. I think that might have just been going through chemo is difficult on your body and your mind. So I don't know if I wasn't in a trial, I think it would have been the same outcome. I don't think I would have worked anyways. So.
Thank you. Let's see here. I do have another question. This one also again for Katie. Katie, would you have participated in the clinical trial if you did not know what drug you were taking?
Yeah, yes, I would have. Because of some of the points that I already made, just with the success that they had already had with Hodgkin's lymphoma. And like Dawn said, there was a lot of research on Hodgkin's that I could look up, and I could actually look up some of the trial information. So with that being said, I definitely would have gone through with it no matter what. And I do believe it was 5 years ago almost. So looking back, when I agreed to do the trial, I didn't know what arm I was going to be on. So I agreed to do it before knowing what arm I was on. However, I did know which arm I was on before starting treatment.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Katie, just to be clear, your treatment was brentuximab, correct? Which was a form of chemo.
That was one, like I received, that was only one of the drugs I received while going through treatment, but that was the trial drug I received, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's see here. So I don't see any further questions. However, actually, you know what? A last one just came in, so we'll take this one and then we can move forward. So did Katie join? Sorry about that. Did Katie join the clinical trial as her first line of treatment, or was it an option after she received traditional chemo?
No, that was my first line of treatment.
Okay. And one more question. So again, for you, Katie, you mentioned that you had a baby recently. Did you get reassurances that this would not harm the baby?
So I wasn't pregnant while I was going through treatment, but a little background, I know a lot of, when you're going through chemo, fertility can be something that women worry about. But I did conceive naturally, and that was after treatment. Mm-hmm. So I haven't been scanned or anything since then.
Yeah, I think you're right that fertility is definitely something that people are concerned with during treatment.
Yes, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Sarah, for sharing all this information with us. However, if you do have any more questions, please do not hesitate to contact us. If you need more information, you can do so by calling toll-free or by email at canadainfo@lls.org. Also, make sure to check out our website regularly for the dates of our upcoming webcasts or to watch all our past webcasts as well. Please note that a short survey will be sent to all participants after this webcast. We would greatly appreciate you taking a moment to fill it in, as it will really help us to offer you the most valuable information in the near future. So thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful day.